What's up, guys? Welcome back to the shop. In today's video, we're gonna be making an axe out of rebar. Here I got a piece of rebar I got from Home Depot. It is about 60 inches long, and we're gonna be using it to do the outline of the axe. And for the edge, I'm gonna be forging up a little piece of sand mine to create a good hardenable edge, and hopefully it'll look pretty as well. So let's get started. First thing I'm gonna do is make a template or a guide for being able to bend this guy to be able to fit my axe handle shape. So here I have a rough sketch of what I'm going to be making. This is going to be the handle, and I'm going to be using pivots like this that are going to be welded to certain parts so I can bend the rebar in whatever shape I need. Here in this part, I'll be putting two, and I'll just be bending it over and cutting the rebar in half. And that way I can sandwich in my my steel so I can forge weld for an edge, and hopefully it turns out okay and it doesn't look like crap. But to be honest, this is actually my second rendition. The first one I scrapped because it did look like crap, so hopefully this one looks better. Let me tell you guys a little bit about the idea behind this build. So I was on YouTube, as I sometimes do, scrolling around through shorts, or it might have been Instagram looking at reels, I'm not really sure. I remember correctly, but I saw a guy forge an axe out of rebar, and I thought that was a pretty cool idea, except the thing I didn't like is that they forged the edge out of rebar as well. So I figured rebar is a mild steel, unless it must have been some kind of special rebar, I don't know. They still quenched it and hardened it, but I mean, mild steel doesn't really get hard when you quench it because it has such a low carbon content. It doesn't really create that structure and, get the hardness that you would with a knife steel or tool steel. So I figured I would make my own, and I would replace it with an actual hardenable steel. And I figured I could make this jig and use it, and as you can see, it does not work out as planned. Sometimes things appear better on my mind before they, once I actually make them, they don't come out exactly how they came out in my mind. But it was a pretty cool idea nonetheless. One of the biggest hurdles I came across on this build was being able to fit this in my forge and actually, heating the sections. So this first bend was very difficult to do. And as you can see, I already broke one of the little rebar pins that I had done because I had figured I could just tack them on and it wouldn't be too much of a big deal, but it ended up being a pretty big deal. And the little tacks weren't strong enough to hold it, so I did have to go back and off screen re-weld everything to make it a little bit more solid. One more thing that I did here that I probably wouldn't do again if I ever did this again, which I probably won't, is that when I made my jig, I actually traced an old handle I had there, and then I placed my rebar pins on the outside of the handle, or on the inside, it doesn't really matter. Regardless, I didn't take into account the thickness of the rebar. This rebar is 5/8 thick if I'm not mistaken, and just by putting it up close together, it's already, pretty decent thickness for the hand. Had I left the gap that I intended to with my drawing, I would not be able to hold it, as it would have been a little bit too big. Another thing that I run into on this build is, since I have such a small work area, I'm using a one-car garage is what I have for my workspace. I don't really have anywhere solid that I can actually put it up against and use real force to bend the rebar. I have nothing stationary, nothing actually bolted down or tied down or heavy enough to not move. So I constantly found myself running into the issue of whenever I would try to exert force, like here where I'm hammering it, everything would just move around and I wouldn't really get that steady force I wanted. So things were very difficult to move around and get exactly the way I wanted. And also in my mind, it seemed a lot easier than it actually was. So yeah, I'll definitely admit that. Sometimes you run into problems, whether it's working at your house or fixing something here, fixing something there. You're like, yeah, I got it, and then you realize you don't got it. it was not as easy as it seemed, and I ran into that issue on this build, especially with the forge welding that's about to come up here shortly. So mind you, as I'm working on this piece doesn't really fit in my forge, so it's really difficult to get a proper heat. And so I fluxed and I heated the two tips where they met right there, and I wanted to just forge weld them together and make a spike. But unfortunately, I don't know if it was too dirty or what the issue was, but I could not get it to stick for the life of me. Alright guys, so here we have our steel for our edge. I have two pieces of mild steel right here, and I'm going to be putting them in between like this. And this is ADCRV2, which will be our hardenable edge. It's a quarter thick, and these two parts are also a quarter thick. So I'm going to tack this up, and I'm going to forge weld it. Then I'll just cut off whatever ends I don't need, and we'll go from there. Here, what I'm spraying down the billet with is some WD-40. It's still hot from the welding, that's why it's steaming so much. But I'm just spraying it with some WD-40 and making sure it gets into all the nooks and crannies, just to help promote a better forge weld. And once it gets nice and hot, I go on ahead and put some flux on there. I ended up buying this cheese grater off of Amazon, and this thing is great for fluxing stuff. I used to just do it by hand and it kind of went everywhere. But now, since I use this guy, it's made it a lot easier, and I can, more uniformly just spray it everywhere or shake it everywhere. And this was pretty straightforward. It's just a simple forge weld. I have a sand mild steel on the outside and a ADCRV2 core on the inside with a little bit sticking out just because I didn't want to end up removing that. And it's all good steel, so regardless of where it's sticking out, it's still going to be more of an insurance that it's good steel at the edge and not running into the issues of having steel crossover where it shouldn't. Alright guys, so we got about this far in the axe making process. And it's not looking how I want it to, but it's okay. That thing worked about as good as I thought it was going to work, which was pretty crappy. But this is as far as we got. I tried to forge weld this part, but I couldn't forge weld it because it was too dirty. So I'm going to clean that, and I'm going to put a piece of hardenable steel here. I'm going to try to make a spike and harden it. And for this part right here, I'm actually going to cut it in half. And I'm going to slide in this guy right here that I had made. And we're just going to slide it in like so. And hopefully we can forge weld that. And then we're going to have to put some beads of weld in here just to hold these together. Because one thing I noticed while I was trying to forge weld this guy was there was a lot of movement. And that movement was not helping at all. So I think I'm going to do a bead of weld in here on both sides, hold that together, and I'm going to clean this up and put a piece of steel in there, and possibly do a forge welding session like that, and then finally cut the inside here and forge weld it in there, or maybe I'll just do both at the same time. I don't know. I'll figure that out as I go. But for now, I'm going to weld these spots in, and we'll go from there. So this is a piece of ADCRV2 that I'm going to be forge welding on there, and I ended up grinding it into a wedge so it would fit in there a little bit better. I should have made this piece a little bit shorter because it stands way too proud, but that's one of those things where I winged it, and better luck next time, I guess. But at the moment I thought, well, if I cut it in half, what am I going to do with the other tiny little piece? So I figured I'd just weld the whole thing on there anyways. And here I had the bright idea of just cutting it down the middle and wedging it open and putting in the sand mine that I had forged out. And though it doesn't show here, I did heat it up with the torch before trying to force it open, and I ended up cracking the steel a little bit. And I also realized that my piece actually stuck way too proud and it wasn't going to fit in my forge, so I ended up just scrapping that whole front piece and just notching the two pieces of rebar and welding it on there, and I'm just gonna forge weld the whole thing together. Here I am fluxing both pieces. As I said before, it's really hard to get it in there far enough to properly heat all sides. So because of that, I decided to concentrate on the edge first, which was more important. If the other piece didn't forge weld, it didn't forge weld. And so I concentrated on the actual edge portion first. And I fortunately got a very good forge weld on the front part. And when I went to forging the back piece, I struggled back and forth and I couldn't get it to forge for the life of me. It really got frustrating at one point and I didn't know what to do. I was just heating it, fluxing it, cleaning it, hitting it, fluxing it, cleaning it. And this was one of my bigger failures on this project because for the life of me I could not forge weld or get those pieces to stick whatsoever. I would get one side to stick and then the other side would move, and then I'd get that side to forge and then the other side would unstick. Man, it was a nightmare. And eventually I gave up on it and I moved to working on the edge instead, getting a little bit more length and a little bit more width for the axe blade. That way it would work out better. And after a lot of trial and error, and a lot of more error than anything, I ended up giving up on forge welding this piece, and I opted out to just weld it. Since it was already pretty hot, it helped the weld get a little bit deeper in there. Now that I think about it, I should have set my machine to 220 and picked it up as strong as it could. That way I could get better penetration. But overall, I got a pretty good weld on there with the machine. And I gave it a few more whacks off camera, but I don't know if it properly welded in there. I'm pretty sure it didn't, but hopefully the weld holds it in place. Here I'm just working that edge, and I'm going for my quench. I opted out to just go on ahead and go straight with my quench instead of grinding it, because it's already pretty thin towards the edge, so I can get away with just forging it right now and then grinding it later. Regardless, I have to do a tempering cycle with the torch instead of doing it with my oven, because my axe just doesn't fit in there. Well, now that I think about it, while I'm doing this voiceover, it did fit in my conventional oven, in my kitchen oven, not my toaster oven, but it didn't cross my mind at the time. That's why I am grinding on it. This is fresh out of the quench. That's why I'm wearing my gloves, because it's still pretty toasty. And I'm just grinding on it a little bit, cleaning it up so I can actually see the tempered colors while I'm tempering it with the torch. And I'm going for a bluish color for my temper on both sides. And now that the hardest part is done, all I have to do is some minor shaping and grinding off of my edge and some shaping on the spike, and I'm essentially done for the most part. The most laborious part of this build was actually trying to get that outline the way I wanted to, and getting everything to forge weld up properly, or improperly in the case of the spike at the end. And honestly, it's a little frustrating that I could not get that to weld, and I ended up welding it with my machine, because that was a little frustrating. I can get most things to weld, but for some reason I struggle with rebar. Let me know in the comments down below what do you think I did wrong there, or if you have any experience with that, because I've heard rebar is a pain to weld sometimes. So let me know in the comments down below. And after getting everything grinded and clean, I'm just gonna hit it with that wire wheel, that really aggressive wire wheel. That way I can get it back to bare steel, and it just looks a little bit nicer, more consistent, instead of having that burnt oil finish that it had. And after giving it a good sharpen, it is sharp enough for wood. So we're gonna go off into our ferric chloride. Now, on the ferric chloride, I wasn't expecting it to change very much. I knew there was going to be a little bit of contrast between the mild steel and the ADC RV2, and I was happy with the end result on that. Alright, so I'm essentially almost done with this guy. It's looking pretty good. I mean, as good as it's going to be. It's a crappy little axe that definitely didn't turn out the way I wanted. But overall, I'm still pretty happy with it. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a leather wrap around the handle just to make it a little bit more comfortable. And for that, I got this, just a 1-inch leather, and I'm just gonna super glue it to the handle, and we should be good to go. Got this off of Amazon. So this wrap was another one of those pieces where I figured it was gonna be pretty simple and pretty quick, but it ended up being a little bit of a headache. It's a pain to wrap around that rebar and get those corners to, come in nice and tight. And though the super glue and the Starbond accelerator worked very well, it did take a bit of finicking with it and messing around with it to get it all to stick properly. And before I got into the groove of it, once I got into the groove of it and I got onto that straighter portion, I definitely did go a lot faster, and it was a lot easier. Some corners, some edges didn't come out exactly the way I wanted to, but that's the story with this whole axe. So I'm pretty happy with the way it ended up. So if you like this build and you like the way I do things on this channel and you want to support on a monetary fashion, I did start a Patreon, and if you're interested in joining that, I will have a link in the description down below. I really appreciate that. I have one subscriber on there, and he's getting lonely, and he told me it's never going to grow if I don't shout it out, which, I mean, he does have a point. So I would really appreciate it if some of you guys went and subscribed, and we'll be having talks on there for future builds and the future of the channel, what I'm going to be moving forward with doing, and we're gonna have some very fun interactions there. So I would really appreciate your guys' support on that. And as always, thank you very much for watching. I greatly appreciate y'all, and I will catch y'all on the next one. Peace.